Yesterday, I personally poured the champagne to toast the most vicious enemy of my entire life. And the most disgusting part? That enemy calls me Dad. Under a searing mustard-yellow sunset over Silicon Valley, I stood back in the corner of my own backyard. At the center of the party, my 28-year-old son was being worshipped like some kind of tech messiah. My wife drifted across the lawn in a blazing orange silk dress, kissing the cheeks of hard-nosed investors, bragging about the $50 million super algorithm her son had stumbled onto by accident. They let their eyes slide over me, an aging engineer hunched over a smoking grill, with a coldness, a flatness, gray and lifeless as sheet metal. It was the look of people who had just finished draining a battery and were about to toss it in the trash. But here's the truth. The kid holding court on that little makeshift stage couldn't write a single functioning line of code to save his life. The entire project driving venture capitalists into a $50 million frenzy? It was exactly what I'd paid for in blood, sweat, and 15 years of my life, buried in a basement nobody in that family ever bothered to walk down into. They didn't just steal my mind. They sold off my entire existence, using a security password my own wife had quietly cracked and handed to our son like a party favor. Welcome to Old Dad's Revenge, where we tear off the fake masks of family and watch the broken, trampled fathers finally rise. My wife and son believe they've pulled off the heist of the century. They're convinced the moral noose of blood is thicker than water, and family reputation will strangle me into silence. But here's what should send a chill down your spine. I'm not going to expose them. I'm not going to stop the deal. That's right. I'm going to smile and watch them arrogantly sign that contract. I'm going to let them touch that $50 million with their own hands. Because buried deep inside those millions of stolen lines of code, I planted a biometric ghost. And the very second that fortune lands in their account, the core of that algorithm will collapse on itself, lock down the fund's entire system, and fire a federal fraud report straight to the servers of the FBI. I'm not just taking my name back. I'm putting these bloodless parasites behind bars. Lean back, pour yourself a stiff bourbon, drop your thoughts in the comments, and hit subscribe right now. Because the coldest revenge in this world isn't screaming and smashing things. It's standing perfectly still, smiling, and watching your enemies gleefully lock themselves inside their own prison cell. If you're watching this from somewhere, the sun hasn't even come up yet, or you're on your lunch break, sneaking a video in, drop your city below. I want to know exactly how far this story is traveling. My name is Nolan Whitcomb. I am 60 years old, and for 32 of those years, I have been the invisible wallet, propping up a family that never once bothered to look at the man holding it open. The backyard of our house in Los Altos Hills was staged that afternoon like a magazine spread. String lights threaded through the olive trees, a jazz trio in the corner playing something soft and expensive, and a caterer's crew circulating with trays of champagne flutes that cost more per glass than the shirt on my back. My wife, Gwendolyn, had spent $11,000 on this party. I know the exact number because I paid the invoice myself, the way I have paid every invoice in this family for 3 decades, without complaint, without a single word of acknowledgement, without so much as a thank you scrawled on a card. At the center of it all stood my son, Bradley. 28 years old, wearing a black turtleneck in 78-degree weather because some CEO he idolized on a podcast once wore one, and holding a champagne flute like a man who had just discovered gravity. Around him, a cluster of Silicon Valley's most self-satisfied faces hung on his every word. Men in quarter-zip fleeces who moved 11-figure funds with a flick of a term sheet. Women in white linen who ran newsletters read by half the venture capital world. They had all come to worship at the altar of my son's supposed genius. I stood at the grill in the corner, the way I always stand at the grill in the corner, flipping bratwurst and short ribs while smoke stung my eyes. Nobody offers to relieve the man at the grill. Nobody thinks to ask if the man at the grill would like a glass of the $11,000 champagne. In this family, I am furniture that occasionally speaks, useful when the lawn needs mowing or the mortgage needs paying, invisible everywhere else. A man I vaguely recognized as a managing partner at some fund clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to nearly knock the tongs from my hand. "You must be so proud of your boy," he said, in the particular tone people use when they've already decided you don't matter. "A genius like that? I guess you can finally retire, old-timer." I said nothing. I have learned over 3 decades of marriage to Gwendolyn that saying nothing is often the only dignity left available to me. Then Bradley climbed onto the low stone retaining wall that rings our pool, tapped his glass with a fork, and the crowd hushed like a congregation waiting for scripture. 18 months ago, he began, his voice pitched for maximum effect, I was meditating on a mountain trail above Woodside, and it just hit me. A completely new approach to lossless data compression, a way to fold information density that nobody in the industry had ever considered. He paused for effect, basking in the murmur that rippled through the crowd. And this morning, Ironbridge Ventures wired $50 million into Vantix's seed round. $50 million for an idea I had while breathing. The crowd erupted. Champagne flutes rose. Someone shouted, "To the future!" And a dozen voices echoed it back, glasses clinking in the dusk like tiny mocking bells. I stood absolutely still, spatula frozen in midair, and listened as my son described, in loose but unmistakable technical language, the exact architecture of an algorithm I'd spent 15 years building alone, one insomniac night at a time, in the unfinished basement beneath our house. The entropy folding method, the recursive dictionary compression layer, the specific, idiosyncratic naming convention I use for my variable trees, a convention I invented that exists nowhere else on this earth, that I have never once explained to another living soul, let alone to my own son, who has never asked me a single question about my work in over a decade. This was not a similar idea. This was not 2 minds arriving independently at the same discovery, the way it sometimes happens in science. This was my code, my 15 years, recited back to a room full of strangers by a boy who has never, in his entire adult life, opened a single line of source code, let alone written one. The tongs slipped from my hand and clattered onto the flagstone. Nobody noticed. Nobody ever notices anything I do except when the checkbook is involved. I looked past Bradley toward the sliding glass door that leads down into my basement, the room my family has treated for 15 years as a punchline, a place where Dad goes to tinker with his little computer projects, a room none of them, not my wife, not my son, not my daughter Kendall, has voluntarily entered more than a handful of times in 15 years. That basement holds a server rack I built with my own hands, a cooling system I engineered myself, and 15 years of a life's work that I never once thought to lock behind more than a simple password, because who in this family would ever care enough to look? Kendall, my daughter, stood near the pool in a cream blazer, already narrating the moment for the cameras of 3 different content creators she had hired for the party. She is 31, works in public relations, and has spent the last several years quietly rebuilding Bradley's public image, transforming a college dropout with a string of failed apps into a visionary founder through sheer force of press releases and curated lighting. I watched her mouth the words self-taught genius to a videographer, watched her gesture toward Bradley like a curator unveiling a masterpiece she herself had sculpted from nothing. Gwendolyn appeared at my elbow then, smelling of jasmine and champagne, her orange silk dress catching the last of the sunset. She has never once, in 3 decades, called what I do downstairs work. It is always puttering, always your little hobby, dear. She looked at me now with the faint, indulgent amusement of a woman checking in on a pet that had, against all odds, not made a mess of the carpet. "Isn't it wonderful, Nolan?" she said, not really asking. "Our boy is going to change everything." She glanced at the grill, at the smoke, at the tongs I hadn't yet picked back up off the ground. Don't let the ribs burn. People are hungry, and I will not have this evening remembered for burnt meat. I bent down, retrieved the tongs, and went back to the grill, because that is what I am for in this house. But something in me had gone very quiet in that moment. Not sad, not yet. Quiet the way a machine goes quiet right before it reroutes all its power to a single silent purpose. I flipped the short ribs. I smiled when photographed. I let a stranger clap me on the shoulder twice more and call me old-timer once more. And underneath all of it, underneath 32 years of being treated as the ATM machine of this family, one thought settled into place with the cold precision of a line of finished code. They had just stolen from the wrong engineer. I would not scream. I would not overturn the folding table of hors d'oeuvres, though God knows some animal part of me wanted to. I would simply go downstairs later, after the guests had gone home and the string lights had been switched off, and I would find out exactly how deep this betrayal ran. Because 32 years of silence had taught me one thing above all else. In this house, the truth was never given freely. It had to be extracted, bite by bite, from the machine no one ever thought to check. The party wound down past midnight. Guests drifted out through the side gate in twos and threes, their laughter fading into the dark cul-de-sac, their headlights sweeping across the front of a house that from the outside looked exactly like the American dream. Gwendolyn went up to bed with a satisfied smile still pulling at the corners of her mouth, already planning, I was certain, the next party they would throw with money that was never theirs to spend. Bradley stayed up another hour on the back patio, showing off the fund's official term sheet on his phone to the last two stragglers, his voice loud with a confidence that belonged by every right to me. I waited until the house had gone still, until the only sound left was the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of the pool filter cycling through the dark. Then I walked in my socked feet down the carpeted stairs toward the one room in this house that had always quietly belonged only to me, and to the 15 years of my life I had buried inside it, believing foolishly that it was safe simply because no one else cared to look. The basement smelled the way it always smells. Cold concrete, ozone from the cooling fans, the faint metallic tang of a server rack that never truly sleeps. I flipped on the single overhead bulb and stood for a moment in the doorway, looking at the room the way a stranger might, trying to see it fresh. 2 workstations, a wall of hand-labeled hard drives going back 15 years, a whiteboard covered in my own handwriting, half-erased equations from a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago when I thought I'd finally cracked the last inefficiency in the recursive layer. This room had been my only refuge for a decade and a half, the one place in this entire house where I was not a wallet, not a punchline, only an engineer with something worth building. I did not go to my desk first. I went straight to the server rack, sat down at the terminal, and pulled the access logs, my hands steadier than I expected them to be, given what some quiet, buried instinct already suspected I would find. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what I found. I did not build a locked vault down here. I never imagined I needed one. This was my family's house. My wife slept 2 floors above me. My children had grown up walking past that basement door 1,000 times on their way to the kitchen. The idea that any of them would ever come down here with the intention of taking something from me had simply never occurred to me, not once, in 15 years. So the password on my primary server was not some elaborate 64-character passphrase. It was reasonably strong, but it was mine, and I had, exactly once, 8 months earlier, typed it into the shared family iPad to pull up a file for Gwendolyn while my hands were full of groceries. I remember the moment clearly. I remember thinking absolutely nothing of it at the time. The access log told a very different story than the one Bradley had performed for a crowd of strangers that evening. There had been no mountain trail epiphany, no flash of inspiration on some scenic ridge above Woodside, no moment of accidental genius. There had been a sequence of remote logins beginning 4 months ago, all originating from the house's own network, all occurring late at night, all using my credentials. Someone had connected to my server, copied the entire Vantix compression architecture, every file, every commit, every iteration of 15 years of my life, onto an external drive, and walked out with it as easily as taking a casserole dish out of the refrigerator on a Sunday afternoon. Bradley did not do this himself. I want to be clear about that because it matters, and because it is the part that broke something in me that night more than the theft itself did. My son does not know what a terminal is. He has never once, in 28 years, demonstrated the patience or the technical curiosity required to navigate a file directory, let alone breach a password-protected server and exfiltrate 15 years of source code. Someone had to hand it to him. Someone had to unlock the door, walk him inside, and point him directly toward the treasure like a tour guide. I found the answer 40 minutes later, on the shared family iPad that sits charging on the kitchen counter, the one Gwendolyn and I have used interchangeably for a decade to order groceries and check the weather. I should not have looked. Some part of me knew, even as I picked it up, that I was about to see something I could never unsee. But 32 years of silence had earned me at least this much: the right to know exactly what had been done to me, in my own house, by my own family. The messages were still there, unhidden, unguarded, because neither of them had ever imagined I would think to look. A thread between Gwendolyn and Bradley, dated 4 months back, in the calm, transactional tone of two people discussing a grocery run rather than a theft. Bradley: Mom, I need something real for the pitch deck. The app ideas aren't landing. Investors want deep tech, not another social app. Gwendolyn: Your father has that data thing he's been doing in the basement for years. I don't understand a word of it, but the men at the club always say compression is the next big thing. Bradley: Is it actually good, like patentable good? Gwendolyn: I have no idea. I've never once looked at it. But he never shows anyone, never talks about selling it, never does anything with it. It's just sitting there. Just take your father's hard drive. He's old anyway. What is he keeping it for besides looking at it? You're the one who needs a future. I read that message 4 times. Slowly the first time, quickly the second. And by the third and fourth readings, I was no longer reading it as language at all. I was reading it as a diagnosis, a clean and clinical verdict on exactly what I had become in this family's eyes. He's old anyway. What is he keeping it for besides looking at it? 32 years of my life, reduced by my own wife to a decorative object gathering dust in a basement, something to be quietly repossessed the moment it became useful to someone she valued more than the man who had earned every dollar in her closet. I scrolled further. There was more. A message from Gwendolyn explaining step by step, in language too specific to be a guess, exactly which password to try, because she had watched over my shoulder that one afternoon 8 months ago, and apparently filed it away for later use, the way a pickpocket studies a mark before the theft. There was Bradley confirming 3 months ago that the download worked. This stuff is insane, way better than anything our engineers came up with. There was Gwendolyn responding with a single word: perfect. Perfect. I set the iPad down on the counter very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid might shatter, though by that point I think it was myself I was afraid of shattering. I did not cry. I want to tell you, I broke down at the kitchen counter at 2 a.m, that there were tears, that there was some cathartic collapse. There wasn't. What came instead was stranger and colder than grief, a kind of total, systemic stillness, as though every emotional subroutine in me had simultaneously crashed and rebooted into something leaner, quieter, and entirely without mercy. I thought, standing there, of 32 years of anniversaries where I bought the flowers, because Gwendolyn said flowers from me were the least you can do. I thought of every birthday of Bradley's I paid for, and was too tired from work to properly attend. I thought of how naturally, how instinctively, this family had learned to see me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be known. None of it had prepared me for the particular surgical cruelty of "he's old anyway," typed out so casually by the woman who had shared my bed for 3 decades. I understood, standing there in my socked feet, in my own kitchen at 2 a.m, that I had spent 32 years being slowly, deliberately drained by the 2 people I trusted most in this world. Drained the way you drain a battery you never intend to recharge, only to discard once it stops being useful. Gwendolyn had not stumbled onto my password by accident. She had watched me type it, memorized it, and waited months for the right moment to hand it to our son like a housewarming gift for the life he was about to steal. This was not a lapse in judgment. This was a plan, executed with the same cold efficiency I usually reserved for my own code, patient and deliberate, in a way I never once suspected my own wife capable of. I went back down to the basement before sunrise, moving quietly through a house that had never felt more like enemy territory. I did not touch anything upstairs, did not wake anyone, did not so much as raise my voice in the empty rooms. I simply sat at my terminal, opened the master repository for the compression engine, and began very calmly to write. There was one thing Gwendolyn did not know, one thing Bradley had never thought to ask about, because neither of them had ever cared enough about my work to ask a single real question about how it functioned or what it contained. Buried in the deepest layer of that architecture, in a module I had built and rebuilt a dozen times over the years, sat a piece of code that had nothing to do with compression ratios or entropy folding. It was something else entirely, something personal, something private, something I had never told a living soul about, something they would not discover until it was far, far too late for either of them to matter. I did not confront Gwendolyn with the messages. I want to explain why, because it matters for everything that follows. Confrontation gives the other person a script to perform against. I had watched this family perform for me my entire marriage, performed gratitude at Christmas, performed affection at anniversaries, performed pride at graduations they'd barely funded. I was not going to hand them one more stage to act on. So instead, 2 mornings after the party, over coffee at the kitchen island, I let something slip out sideways, almost idly, the way a man simply thinking out loud might. "Funny thing," I said, not looking up from my mug. "Bradley's algorithm, the compression method he described at the party. It sounds a lot like something I've been working on downstairs." I watched Gwendolyn's face carefully over the rim of my cup. For half a second, less than half a second really, a flicker most people would have missed entirely, something moved behind her eyes. Recognition, calculation, and then it was gone, replaced by an expression I had seen her deploy 1,000 times before, at parent-teacher conferences and country club board meetings, and every difficult conversation of our 32-year marriage. Wounded, righteous indignation deployed with the practiced ease of a woman who had never once, in 3 decades, been forced to sit with genuine guilt for more than a few seconds at a time. "Nolan," she set down her own mug with a click that was just slightly too sharp for the moment. "Are you honestly jealous of your own son right now? He worked incredibly hard for this. He didn't sleep for months building that pitch deck. And you're going to sit here and imply he stole a few lines of code from your little hobby project?" Her voice climbed half an octave on the word hobby, the way it always does when she wants a single word to land like a slap. "You wrote some scattered notes in a basement. He built a company. Do you understand the difference? Do you understand how sick that sounds? Accusing your own child of theft?" There it was. Sick. Jealous. In under 15 seconds I had gone from the man whose life's work had been stolen to the villain of the story, and I watched it happen with the same detached fascination I might have brought to watching a well-engineered system execute exactly as designed. This was not improvisation. Gwendolyn did not construct that particular architecture of guilt and reversal in the 2 seconds after I spoke a single sentence. This was a defense she had clearly rehearsed privately, in advance, anticipating this exact conversation because some part of her had always known, on some buried level, that this day might eventually come. "I never said he stole anything," I said quietly, which was technically true. I had said nothing of the kind. I had simply observed a similarity out loud, and watched a guilty flinch answer a question I had not fully asked. "You didn't have to say it, Nolan. I can hear it in your voice." She stood, gathering her mug, her robe, her dignity around her like armor plating. "This is exactly why nobody in this family tells you anything anymore. You take every piece of good news and find a way to make it about your own bruised ego. Your son just secured his future, our family's future, and instead of celebrating him, you're down here scheming up ways to steal his moment from him. Steal his moment." I let that phrase sit in the air of the kitchen for a long moment after she left the room. The theft, in her telling, was mine, a theft not yet even committed, a crime of the imagination she had preemptively assigned to me before I had accused a single soul of anything at all. It was, I thought, watching the steam curl off my forgotten coffee, an almost elegant piece of engineering in its own right, this reversal. She had taken the accusation before I could even finish forming it and welded it permanently to my own name. By that evening, the gaslighting had metastasized beyond our kitchen and into the public record. Kendall, my daughter, 31 years old, a public relations strategist with a talent for narrative I once, foolishly, admired without reservation, published a piece in a Forbes contributor column titled "The Self-Taught Founders Redefining Deep Tech." I read it standing at the kitchen counter, my coffee going cold in my hand. It described Bradley as a self-taught pioneer who had leapfrogged an entire generation of credentialed engineers through raw intuition and fearless curiosity. It did not mention me. It did not mention the basement, or the 15 years, or a single fact that might have complicated the myth Kendall was constructing brick by brick, with the same fluent skill she'd once shown building sandcastles on family vacations I'd quietly paid for. Further down, in a passage that made my hands go genuinely cold around my mug, Kendall took a swipe at what she called the old guard of Silicon Valley engineering. Men, she wrote, so entrenched in outdated methodologies and territorial thinking that they've become obstacles to the very innovation they claim to champion. She did not name me. She did not have to. I knew, and worse, I understood in that moment that Kendall knew too, that somewhere in the family group chat, or over some private phone call I hadn't been included in, Gwendolyn had briefed our daughter on the problem I represented, and Kendall had responded not with a single question, not with one moment of doubt about her own father, but with a professionally polished article designed to inoculate her brother against exactly the truth I actually possessed. Within days I had become, quietly and almost without my noticing the mechanism of it, the villain inside my own home. Family dinners grew clipped and strange. Bradley stopped making eye contact with me across the table, replacing conversation with a determined, studious focus on his phone. Gwendolyn began prefacing every mention of my basement work with a small, indulgent sigh, as though I were an aging relative whose confusion needed to be gently managed, rather than a man whose life's work had been stripped from him in the dark of his own house. Even the housekeeper, I noticed, had begun treating me with a new, careful gentleness, the kind reserved for people the rest of the household has quietly agreed are not entirely well anymore. One dinner in particular has stayed lodged in my memory since. Gwendolyn had made a rare effort. Roasted salmon, the good wine, candles she never bothers with unless company is coming. Bradley arrived 20 minutes late, still on a call with someone from Ironbridge, and slid into his chair without so much as an apology. Kendall spent most of the meal narrating, unprompted, the metrics on her Forbes piece, the shares, the comments. A producer from a business news network who had already reached out about booking Bradley for an interview. "They want to call it garage genius," Kendall said, beaming, cutting her salmon with theatrical precision. "Very underdog, very relatable." "There's no garage," I said. It was the first full sentence I had spoken since sitting down. "There's a basement. My basement." The table went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet. When someone has broken an unspoken rule, everyone else had agreed to follow. Gwendolyn's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Bradley finally looked up from his phone, his expression flickering, for just a moment. The same flicker I'd seen in his mother's eyes days earlier, before hardening into practiced offense. "Dad, are you seriously doing this again? At dinner?" His voice carried the wounded, put-upon tone of a man far younger than 28. "I worked my ass off for this. Why can't you just be happy for me for once, instead of making everything about your ego?" "I'm happy for you," I said, and smiled, and reached for my wine, and let the moment close over itself like water after a stone. Gwendolyn shot me a look of pure, triumphant vindication, as though my silence had just proven her diagnosis correct. Nobody at that table understood that I had not backed down. I had simply finished gathering the last piece of information I needed, the certainty, absolute and unshakable, that not one of them intended to give an inch, ever, unless I forced the reckoning myself. I said nothing more about the algorithm after that night. I asked no more pointed questions. I let them believe completely that their maneuver had worked, that the jealous, sick, bitter old engineer had been successfully managed, contained, talked back down into his basement where he belonged and had always belonged. I smiled at dinner. I complimented Bradley's blazer. I told Kendall her article was well written, which had the added benefit of being entirely true, in the narrow, technical sense that a well-constructed lie can still be beautifully written. But every night after the house went quiet, I went back downstairs and I kept building. Not the compression engine itself. That work was long finished, polished, proven, and stolen. I was building something else now, something smaller and far more precise, nested so deeply inside the architecture Bradley had taken that no engineer at Ironbridge Ventures, no due diligence team, no army of lawyers would ever think to look for it. I had spent 32 years being underestimated in that house, dismissed as harmless, indulged like a man tinkering in his shed. I intended to make absolutely certain it was the very last mistake any of them would ever make. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, 10 days after the party, and I only knew about it because Gwendolyn, in her rising panic, forgot to close the office door behind her. Ironbridge Ventures' legal team had found what they described delicately as a minor issue in the chain of title. Somewhere in their due diligence, a paralegal had cross-referenced network logs against the IP address history on Bradley's laptop and discovered that every one of his development sessions for Vantix had originated from our home's residential internet connection. The same network, the same router, the same physical address as the basement server that had, according to public records, been registered to one Nolan Whitcomb for the past 15 years. It was, on paper, a very small thing to notice. It was, in practice, a crack that could swallow the entire deal whole. It was the kind of clerical wrinkle that competent lawyers iron out in an afternoon, under normal circumstances. But $50 million does not move on wrinkles. Ironbridge's counsel wanted the chain of title airtight, wanted every possible claimant to the intellectual property formally, legally silenced before a single dollar left escrow. And there was exactly one person on this earth whose signature could make that happen: mine. A simple document, an intellectual property waiver and release, surrendering any claim I might have, now or in the future, to the Vantix compression architecture in exchange for nothing at all beyond the privilege of watching my family cash a check built entirely on my own stolen work. I was not asked to sign it that day. Instead, something far stranger happened. The entire temperature of the house changed, almost overnight. the way weather shifts before a storm nobody has bothered to forecast. I came home from a supply run Thursday evening to find the kitchen filled with the smell of seared beef and rosemary. A ribeye, my favorite cut, prepared exactly the way I like it, medium rare with a red wine reduction. A meal Gwendolyn had not cooked for me with her own hands in at least 10 years. She met me at the door in an apron, of all things, kissed my cheek, and told me she'd been thinking all week about how hard I work and how little she tells me she appreciates it. I set down the grocery bags and said nothing, because I understood, with the cold clarity of a man reading source code line by line, exactly what program had just begun executing in that kitchen. Dinner was a performance worthy of a Broadway stage. Gwendolyn refilled my wine before I'd finished a glass. Kendall asked me, for what I believe was the first time in her adult life, genuine-sounding questions about how compression algorithms actually work, nodding along with rehearsed fascination at answers she plainly had no real interest in retaining. And then, over dessert, Bradley set down his fork, and I watched my 28-year-old son's eyes fill with what I can only assume was real, if entirely self-serving emotion. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking on cue, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." He came around the table and, astonishingly, knelt beside my chair. The way a man might propose marriage or beg forgiveness in a movie he'd clearly studied closely for the blocking. "Everything I've done, the company, the deal, all of it, it was never about me. It was about making the Whitcomb name mean something, about giving you and Mom a legacy, a name people respect, after everything you built for this family. There's a small paperwork thing the lawyers need. It's nothing, it's a formality, but I need your signature. Please, Dad, for the family, for our name." I looked down at my son, kneeling on the hardwood floor of the kitchen I had paid to remodel twice, his eyes wet, his voice trembling with a grief that had appeared conveniently at the exact moment $50 million required my cooperation to close. And I understood in that moment precisely what they were asking of me. They wanted me to take up the pen myself. They wanted me to be the one to formally, legally, permanently execute my own erasure, to sign away 15 years of my own mind and call the signing an act of love, so that none of them would ever have to carry the weight of having taken it from me by force. They wanted a willing victim, because a willing victim requires no guilt from anyone standing around him. Gwendolyn reached across the table and took my free hand in both of hers, her thumb stroking my knuckles, the way she used to when we were young and the future still belonged to both of us equally, before either of us had learned what the other was truly capable of. "We're a family, Nolan," she said softly. "Families do things for each other. This is what love looks like sometimes. Sacrifice, without keeping score. Without keeping score, as though I had ever, in 32 years, once kept score of a single dollar I spent on this family, until the night I discovered they had been keeping score of me the entire time, tallying my worth down to the exact moment I stopped being useful and started being an obstacle standing between them and someone else's money. I let the silence stretch just long enough to be believable. I looked at Bradley, still kneeling, his manufactured tears catching the candlelight. I looked at Gwendolyn, her hand warm and practiced around mine. I looked at Kendall, watching the whole scene unfold with the professional satisfaction of a director whose cast had nailed the blocking on the very first take. Then I smiled, genuinely, warmly, the smile of a tired old man finally giving in to the people he loves. And I reached for the folded document sitting on the counter where Gwendolyn had happened to leave it in plain sight. "Of course," I said. "Of course I'll sign it. You're my family." I folded the waiver carefully and slid it into my jacket pocket. "I'll bring it to the meeting myself next week. I'd like to hand it directly to the lawyers. Shake their hands. See where this $50 million is actually going before it goes there." The relief that swept across that kitchen was almost visible a physical loosening in every shoulder at the table. Gwendolyn exhaled and laughed, a real laugh, the first genuine sound I'd heard from her in weeks. Bradley rose from the floor and hugged me so hard I nearly lost my footing, murmuring, "Thank you, Dad, thank you," into my shoulder like a man who had just been pardoned from a sentence he'd fully expected to serve. Kendall was already texting someone, presumably her PR contacts, presumably drafting some triumphant footnote about the family patriarch's blessing for a future press cycle. They believed completely that the marionette had finally accepted his strings, that 32 years of quiet compliance had won out one final time over whatever brief flicker of resistance I'd shown at the kitchen counter days earlier. They thought they had walked me gently back into my cage and locked the door with kindness instead of force, and that I would thank them for the softness of the bars. Later that night, alone in the dark of the basement, I sat for a long time in front of a small, framed photograph I keep on the shelf above my desk, one none of them ever ask about anymore. A little girl, 4 years old, laughing at something just outside the frame. My youngest, Faith, gone 20 years now, a loss none of them have spoken of aloud in over a decade, as though grief itself had become one more inconvenient hobby of mine to be managed and minimized. I touched the edge of the frame once, the way I do most nights, and then I went back to the terminal, because they had no idea that the document in my jacket pocket was, at that very moment, entirely irrelevant to what was actually going to happen in that boardroom. They had no idea that 15 years earlier, in the quietest, most private corner of my own grief, I had built something into that algorithm that no signature, no waiver, no lawyer on either side of that table could ever touch or undo. I sat with that photograph a long while longer that night, listening to the cooling fans hum their steady, patient rhythm, thinking about how strange it was that the only member of this family who had never once tried to take anything from me was the one who could no longer take anything at all. Upstairs, I could hear Gwendolyn's laughter still drifting down through the floorboards, bright and satisfied, certain the war was already won. Let her believe it. Certainty, I had learned, made people careless, and careless people sign whatever you put in front of them without ever once reading past the first page. The Ironbridge Ventures headquarters occupies the top 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown San Francisco, and the conference room they walked us into that morning had been designed deliberately to make anyone sitting in it feel small. Floor-to-ceiling windows on every side, a slab of black granite for a table, long enough to seat 14, city fog rolling past far below us, so that the whole room seemed to float, untethered, above everything ordinary, including whatever was about to happen inside it. Bradley wore a navy suit that fit him better than any piece of clothing I'd ever seen him in, his hair combed with a precision that told me Kendall had personally supervised his appearance that morning, down to the cufflinks. Gwendolyn had chosen cream and gold, understated, expensive, the exact wardrobe of a woman playing the role of gracious matriarch for an audience of men who controlled $50 million. They sat close together on one side of that long black table, her hand occasionally resting on his forearm, in a gesture of maternal reassurance, clearly staged for the row of investors watching from across the granite, performing a united, loving family for 6 lawyers and 3 managing partners. And for one brief, disorienting moment, I almost admired the sheer commitment of the performance. 32 years of marriage had taught me that Gwendolyn could sell almost anything, given enough motivation. Mr. Whitcomb, the lead counsel, a sharp young woman named Priya Nair, slid a leather folder across the granite toward me, her tone brisk and pleasant, the tone of someone who had never once had this particular kind of meeting go sideways. We appreciate you making the time this morning. This is really just a formality. We simply need your signature on the waiver and the funds released to Vantix within 48 hours. I did not open the folder. I did not reach for the pen sitting neatly beside it, angled at exactly the correct orientation for signing, the way lawyers arrange these things when they've done this 1,000 times and expect no resistance whatsoever. "I didn't bring the waiver," I said. The room did not react immediately, because for a moment nobody quite processed what I'd said. Gwendolyn's smile held, frozen in place a half-second too long. Bradley's hand, resting on the table, went very slightly still, the way an animal goes still when it first senses, without yet understanding why, that something in the room has changed. "I'm sorry," Priyanar said, glancing between me and the folder as though the document itself might clarify the confusion. "I didn't bring it." I reached into my bag instead and set my laptop on the black granite, its plain aluminum shell absurdly out of place among the leather portfolios and crystal water glasses. "I brought this instead. I think everyone in this room deserves to actually understand what you're about to buy for $50 million before any of you spend another minute discussing paperwork that doesn't matter." Gwendolyn's voice cut across the table, tight and bright, with rising panic disguised as pleasantness. "Nolan, sweetheart, I don't think this is the time or the place for one of your—" "It's exactly the time," I said, and something in my tone must have carried more weight than she expected, because she stopped mid-sentence, her mouth still slightly open around the word she never finished. My voice stayed level, quiet, the same flat calm I'd carried since the night I read those messages on the kitchen iPad, weeks ago now, though it felt like a different lifetime. I opened the laptop and connected it to the room's display, and the Vantix architecture, my architecture, bloomed across the wall-mounted screen in front of 9 investors and lawyers who had, until that moment, believed they understood every line of the code they were purchasing. 15 years ago, I said, I began building a compression engine in the basement of my own house. Every commit, every architectural decision, every naming convention in this code belongs to me. I have version histories going back a decade and a half, time-stamped, backed up on independent servers, and notarized 11 months ago, long before my son had ever heard the word entropy used outside of a physics classroom. Bradley's face had gone the color of the granite table. "Dad, what are you doing? This isn't—" "You agreed?" "I'm getting to the part that actually matters, Bradley." I pulled up a single, unremarkable-looking module buried deep in the codebase, one no auditor, no due diligence engineer, and certainly no member of my own family had ever thought to examine closely, because on the surface it did nothing but manage a minor authentication handshake. There is a piece of this architecture I call the ghost module. It doesn't affect compression performance. It doesn't appear in any standard function trace. It exists for exactly one purpose: to verify authorship on command in a way that cannot be faked, cannot be reverse engineered, and cannot be quietly removed without collapsing the entire system built around it. One of the Iron Bridge partners, an older man with silver hair who had said nothing until now, leaned forward slightly. "Are you telling us there's a hidden dependency in production code we're about to fund?" "I'm telling you there's a lock," I said, "and only I have ever held the key." I looked up briefly at Gwendolyn, whose composed matriarch smile had entirely disappeared, replaced by something far more honest: fear, plain and unhidden for the first time in weeks. "The verification key," I continued, "is a specific date, encoded into a biometric weighted hash I designed myself using a heart rate pattern I recorded 20 years ago, my youngest daughter's. Faith. She died when she was 4 years old, and I have never told a single person alive the exact method I used to fold her heartbeat pattern into this system, because it was never meant for anyone but me to find. It was the only way I knew how to keep a piece of her close while I worked, night after night, for 15 years, in a house that had stopped asking where I disappeared to after dinner and eventually stopped asking about her altogether." The room had gone completely silent. Even Priya Nair, a woman I imagine had seen every conceivable disaster a deal room could produce, had stopped moving entirely, her pen frozen an inch above her legal pad. I typed the date, Faith's birthday, the numbers I have entered 1,000 times, in 1,000 quiet, private moments over 2 decades. Numbers Gwendolyn had once known by heart and had not spoken aloud in over 10 years. The screen changed. Every file in the Vantix repository, every commit, every branch, rewrote itself in front of 9 witnesses, resolving into a single unbroken line of authorship that stretched back 15 years, ending in a declaration in stark white text against the black background. Sole author and copyright holder, Nolan Whitcomb. Beneath it, a cryptographic signature no court in the country would ever be able to dispute or unwind. Bradley made a sound that wasn't quite a word. One of the Ironbridge partners actually pushed back his chair, as though putting physical distance between himself and the table might somehow undo what he'd just watched happen on the screen. Priya Nair set down her pen entirely and simply stared, calculating, I imagine, the exact scope of the disaster now unfolding in real time in front of her firm's most important clients. I closed the laptop calmly and looked at my wife and my son for what I understood, even then, might be one of the last times I would ever look at them as family. Everyone in this family has spent years telling me I live in the past, I said, that I'm outdated, irrelevant, a relic who should have retired and gotten out of the way of real progress. I stood, buttoning my jacket, my voice never once rising above the quiet, level register I had carried into that room. You were right about one thing. I do live in the past, and today the past came to collect exactly what belongs to it. Nobody in that room moved to stop me as I gathered my laptop and slid it back into my bag. The silver-haired partner had already turned to Priya Nair, murmuring something about calling the fund's general counsel immediately. Bradley remained frozen in his chair, staring at the now dark screen as though it might, if he stared long enough, reverse itself and give him back the $50 million that had just evaporated in under 90 seconds. Gwendolyn did not speak at all. For the first time in 3 decades of marriage, I watched my wife run out of words entirely, her mouth opening once, twice, and finding nothing behind it worth saying. $50 million evaporated in under 30 seconds. I have thought about that fact many times since, the sheer, almost obscene speed of it. 15 years of my life stolen in an evening, and the fortune built on top of that theft erased in less time than it takes to brew a pot of coffee. The fallout began before we had even left the building. Priya Nair pulled Bradley and Gwendolyn into a side room while I waited in the lobby, and through the glass partition, I watched my son's composure disintegrate entirely, his hands moving in wide, pleading gestures, his face blotchy and stricken, while 3 lawyers stood with their arms crossed and their expressions arranged into the particular blankness of people calculating liability. By the time they emerged 40 minutes later, Bradley would not look at me at all. Gwendolyn's cream and gold outfit looked suddenly like a costume from a play that had just been canceled mid-performance. Ironbridge's general counsel called that same afternoon, and I took the call myself, standing alone in the parking garage while my family sat in stunned silence in the car. The fund was pursuing a formal fraud investigation against Vantix, and specifically against Bradley, for knowingly misrepresenting the authorship and origin of the technology underpinning their seed investment. There was language in that call about securities fraud, about willful misrepresentation, about potential criminal referral, depending on what their internal counsel decided over the following weeks. I listened without interrupting, and when the lawyer asked whether I intended to press any claims of my own against my son personally, I told him truthfully that I hadn't decided yet, and that I would be represented by my own counsel going forward, separate from anything involving my former family. Former family. I noticed myself use that phrase in my own head before I had said a single word of it aloud to anyone, and I understood, standing in that concrete garage, with the phone still warm against my ear, that some decision in me had already been made days ago. Quietly. the way all my most important decisions have always been made, in silence, underground, long before anyone else in that house noticed anything was happening at all. The drive home was the longest 90 minutes of my life. Nobody spoke. Bradley stared out the window with the hollow, unblinking look of a man watching his entire identity dissolve in real time. Gwendolyn sat beside me in the front seat, her hands twisted together in her lap, and every few minutes I felt her glance toward me, searching my face for some sign of the man who had, for 32 years, always eventually forgiven her, always eventually paid for whatever needed paying, always eventually found a way to smooth things over for the sake of the family. She did not find that man in the car with her that afternoon. That man, I think, had died quietly in a kitchen at 2 a.m. weeks earlier, reading a text message that called him old anyway. The collapse, once it started, did not stop at the deal. Word moves fast in Silicon Valley, faster than any of us understood, until we were living inside the wreckage of it. By the following week, the story had leaked, not through any effort of mine, though I suspect nobody in that boardroom particularly cared to protect Bradley's reputation once the fraud investigation began circulating. A tech journalist broke the story under the headline, "Vantic Seed Round Collapses Amid Authorship Fraud Allegations." And within days it had been picked up by 3 other outlets, each one adding new, uglier details Kendall had never anticipated having to manage. The same Forbes platform that had once called Bradley a self-taught pioneer now hosted a follow-up piece dissecting point by point exactly how the fabrication had unraveled. Kendall herself went quiet on social media for the first time in years, her carefully curated narrative machine finally jammed by a story she could not spin her way out of, because this time the facts had teeth of their own. Gwendolyn came to me 3 nights after the meeting, in the guest room where I had been sleeping since we returned from the city. She had been crying, genuinely, I believe, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, though I no longer trusted my own ability to distinguish her genuine tears from her rehearsed ones, and I suspect by that point she could no longer fully tell the difference herself. "Nolan, please." Her voice was raw, stripped of every polished defense she'd deployed over the preceding weeks. "You could fix this. You have the reputation, the notarized authorship, the proof of everything. If you went to Ironbridge, if you told them it was a misunderstanding within the family, that you'd always intended for Bradley to use the technology, they'd believe you. They'd drop the investigation. He's your son, Nolan. He's going to go to prison. Please." I looked at her for a long moment, this woman I had built an entire adult life alongside, and felt something that surprised me with its own quiet neutrality. Not hatred, not even anger anymore, but a kind of clean, final clarity, the way a system feels once every corrupted process has finally been terminated, and the machine simply, calmly reboots. "I'm not going to do that," I said. "Nolan, I spent 32 years bailing this family out," I said, quietly, without ever once being asked how I was doing it or at what cost to myself. I paid every bill. I funded every party. I stood at every grill while people called me an old-timer and asked how proud I must be of the son who never once asked me a single question about my own work. And when I finally had something of my own, something that was entirely, unmistakably mine, you and my son decided the correct response was to take it, and then decide I was the villain for noticing. I reached into my bag, the same bag I had carried into that boardroom days earlier, and set a different set of papers on the table between us. Divorce papers drawn up by my own attorney 3 days prior, filed already, waiting only for her signature to move forward through the courts. Gwendolyn stared at the papers as though I had produced a weapon. "You're doing this now, while our son is facing criminal charges? You'd abandon this family in the middle of a crisis?" "I'm not abandoning anything," I said. "I'm simply refusing, for the first time in 32 years, to be the one who cleans up a mess I didn't make." I stood, buttoning my jacket the way I had in that glass conference room, the same quiet finality in the gesture. Bradley made choices, you made choices, Kendall made choices. I'm not obligated to spend whatever remains of my life absorbing the consequences of decisions I was never once consulted about, only ever billed for afterward. There was no negotiation after that. No bargaining, no tearful reconciliation, no last-minute rescue of the son who had knelt on our kitchen floor weeks earlier and called his fraud an act of love for the family name. I did not co-sign a defense fund. I did not call in favors with old industry contacts to soften the investigation. I did not offer Bradley so much as a single dollar toward the attorney he would eventually need to negotiate a plea agreement with federal prosecutors, a process that would ultimately cost him 2 years of probation, a permanent stain on his professional record, and the complete, humiliating unraveling of every headline Kendall had ever engineered on his behalf. Bradley cornered me in the garage the morning before I moved my first boxes out, his eyes red-rimmed, his expensive turtleneck traded for a plain gray hoodie that made him look, for the first time in years, like the confused young man he actually was underneath all the borrowed confidence. "Dad, I know what I did was wrong," he said. And for a moment I almost believed the admission was real, unscripted, arriving without an audience or an angle attached to it. "But you're really going to just let me go down for this? Your own son? You built this whole system to expose me, and you're not even going to help me survive it?" "I didn't build that system to expose you, Bradley," I said. "I built it 15 years ago in a basement, long before you ever needed exposing. I built it because it was mine to build, and because for once in my life I wanted something that couldn't be taken from me without my permission. You're the one who decided to reach into it and take it anyway." I set down the box I was carrying. "I'm not going to help you survive the consequences of a choice I never made. I spent 32 years helping this family survive consequences that were never mine either, and I called it love, and none of you ever called it anything at all. You just called it Tuesday." He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think, in truth, he had ever once in his life been asked to sit with a consequence he couldn't talk, charm, or cry his way out of, and I watched him standing there in the garage, genuinely unequipped for the first honest reckoning of his adult life, and felt something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite satisfaction, but some third, colder thing I didn't yet have a name for. I moved out of the house in Los Altos Hills 3 weeks later into a modest apartment closer to the city, one I furnished simply, deliberately, with nothing borrowed from a life that had never truly been mine to begin with. I took the server rack. I took the whiteboard, still covered in half-erased equations. I took the frame photograph of Faith, laughing at something just outside the frame, and set it on a shelf in my new office where I could see it every morning while I worked. Within 2 months, working through legitimate counsel and an entirely different set of investors, I sold the Vantix compression architecture myself, properly licensed, transparently documented, sole authorship never once in question, to a mid-sized infrastructure company that had been quietly courting compression talent for years. The deal was smaller than $50 million. It was also entirely, unambiguously mine, built on terms I negotiated myself, at an age everyone in my former family had once assured me was too late for anything new to begin. I do not know, as I record this, whether Gwendolyn and I will ever speak again beyond what the divorce requires of us. I do not know whether Bradley will ever call, though I suspect, when he eventually does, it will be to ask for something rather than to offer anything. Kendall has not reached out at all, which I find, in its own way, the most honest gesture any of them has made toward me in years. What I do know is this. For 32 years I mistook silence for love, and endurance for devotion, and I let a family who never once thought to ask what I was building in that basement decide, without my consent, exactly how much of myself I owed them. I do not regret the 15 years I spent building something real with my own 2 hands, in the dark, while everyone upstairs assumed I was simply puttering. I regret only that it took a betrayal this deep, this cold, this deliberately engineered, to finally teach me the difference between a family and a system designed to extract everything of value from one man and call the extraction love. Being a father was never supposed to mean becoming firewood, stacked quietly in a basement, waiting to be burned so that someone else's greed could stay warm. I built something with 15 years of my life. I will not apologize for finally, at 60 years old, deciding to keep it.